Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and my wormery really just kind of consists of that shelf back there with all those trays on it. Those trays all have worms in them, and the worms are breaking down kitchen scraps and coffee and cardboard, newspaper, you name it. All kinds of different things that are compostable, mainly kitchen scraps, but also some leaves from outside that I bring in once in a while. And a couple of the bins are on my hit list today to be fed. And like I do sometimes, I've got my little info board here explaining which ones I'm talking about. I've got a couple bins. One of them is really the bin with the worms in it. And they're a combination of worms. Over here you can see the description. It says RW, red wiggler, ENC, which means European nightcrawler, and the blue is the Indian blue worm. So it's kind of a mixed combination of different types of worms working together to break down all the different kitchen scraps and household waste that I put into the bin to get broken down. And the worm bin has been in service now for 51 days. And 51 days is when I started the bin. But I had not yet moved all of the worms from their old home out of there yet. So it was 2 weeks later, 37 days ago, when I did pull the last of the worms out of the bin that they had previously been living in to get the last of the population of this bin in there. And then that's kind of when I started the counter for this, what I call the cocoon nursery. So sometimes I take the finished castings of a completed worm bin, and rather than just using the castings out in the garden or whatever, I just kind of keep them around with the assumption that there's a whole bunch of cocoons still within the material, and just give the material some time so that maybe the cocoons will hatch, maybe the baby worms will come out. Then I see if I can round them up. And it's worked a couple times already for me in the past. So I've got that going on over here. Let's get a little bit closer. I'll show you which bins I'm talking about. They're right here. The one on the left is the one that I refer to as the cocoon nursery. And I'm indicating that nowadays with this vertically oriented sticker. So, you know, the bin started on the 4th of December, and at some point when 37 days ago when I pulled the last of the worms out of there to start the regular mixed bin, I didn't even really at that point decide that it was going to become a cocoon nursery. It was only at the last time we came in here to feed this bin 9 days ago was when I decided, you know what, I've got all these castings sitting around. Why don't we just see if there's maybe some baby worms in there and try rounding them up? And it was at that time, 9 days ago, that I not only fed the adult worms in this bin, but I also set up a feeding zone in this bin as well. So I figured after 9 days, the adult bin is probably ready for some food, and I figured we'd also check to see if there's any babies coming together over in the feeding area of the cocoon nursery. So let's get these up on the bench, see what's needed, and then depending on what's needed, I'll head up to the kitchen and grab some of the food scraps that I've got set aside to feed the worms with, and we'll apply the feeding today. So let's get to work. So now, without even looking into the adult bin, I can fairly certainly say that it's probably ready for some food after 9 days. It's really depending on what this bin needs that I'm going to know how to appropriately size the portion that I bring down here. So I don't know exactly what to expect, whether or not we've got baby worms starting to emerge from their cocoons. Are they making their way over into this edge of the bin where we set up a nice comfortable space for them to be attracted to? I really don't know. Chances are we probably won't have to feed here, because even if they did eat the food, all these leaves would also easily double as a food source for them. Although I do like to try to, increase the appeal of what's going on in the feeding area in order to try to, encourage the worms to make their way over there. And besides, placing some yummy foods in there to try to spur on the movement of the worms, I also keep the plastic on here in order to make this side of the bin stay nice and damp. As you can see, the material over on this edge is nice and dark from the recirculating moisture of the plastic being over here. And the stuff over here is drying out gradually by not being covered with plastic. So I spotted one worm over here. Not a huge turnout so far from what I can tell. And the type of foods that I bought down here last time, a little departure from what I usually do. I usually freeze all the foods that I bring down into my wormery, because it's that freezing and subsequent thawing of the materials that really helps to kind of accelerate the breakdown of the materials. So last time when I came down here to feed these systems and to set up this feeding area, I did not use frozen materials. I just took some old, not even that old, but you know, some salad basically. It was a mix of lettuce and tomatoes and cucumbers and even some onion bits and stuff that had just been sitting in the refrigerator for a little bit too long, and the leaves were starting to grow some brown color to them, and it just wasn't very appealing anymore as far as a salad goes. But it did seem like it would be, you know, a suitable material to use as a worm food. So, you know, we saw that little green leaf over there, which I would treat as leftovers, basically, and here too. And, you know, if the stuff had been frozen at some point and then left to thaw, it could have really possibly broken down a lot more quickly and might not have even been recognizable as a green leaf anymore. But when things haven't been frozen, they do take a little longer, or at least so I've found, for them to break down in the worm bins. The moisture level in here seems pretty decent, so I can't say that there's a real need to add any moisture. Especially if we're going to add food, you know. If I put some more food in here, then that food, just by it breaking down, will release moisture as well. And I believe that I probably will put some stuff in here, because all I'm really seeing is what appears to be bedding. So I don't know if there are worms in here that have eaten this stuff, and I'm just having a hard time spotting them. I mean, I've only seen those couple worms that I tried to sort of show on the camera. So it is a little bit hard to understand where the food might have gone. Maybe the food just sort of, you know, deteriorated, broke down, kind of became mush and blended in with the bedding. That might account for some of the moisture that's in here already. But I figured there's no harm in just kind of trying to increase the appeal, especially as time goes on. We probably will have more and more baby worms emerging from their cocoons and looking for a bite to eat. So I believe when I go upstairs to get the food to feed the adult worms with, I will bring just a little bit more, just to be able to add it to this system before we put it away. So, but before I run upstairs to get that food, and before we feed and everything else, I just figured I'd take a quick look through the castings material themselves. You know, like right there, for example. It's a really, really tiny baby worm. No way to tell what kind of worm it is. Sometimes when you see something really, really small like that, and it's colored white like that, you do sometimes question whether it's one of your composting worms or is it just a really big pot worm. But I'm anticipating that what we're seeing here are some of the baby worms that have been gradually emerging from their cocoons. So the material that they inhabit right now is still kind of nice and damp and cozy. It probably has a good amount of leftover food in it as well. So even though I would have a hard time, you know, removing all of the food bits that would keep them completely content and happy to remain in this material, you know, so I can't really do that. But the one thing I can do is continue to leave this end of the bin uncovered and let it continue to dry. And as a result of becoming drier and drier, it would create an environment that the worms would, you know, consider a little bit unfavorable, and hopefully, you know, motivate them to go looking for something a little bit better. And they would find that over here in terms of, you know, having a nice damp, moist place to be. And then we could try to round them up at some point in the future. So down here to a baby worm. Sometimes I don't know if I'm just bumping into one of the worms that I'd already observed earlier. Here's another baby worm. So I'm wondering if they're already kind of zeroing in on the built up moisture that's collecting over here because of the plastic coverings. It's possible. But I guess the other thing, besides giving ourselves a quick view of how the material looks, this also gives us the opportunity to try to agitate the material a little bit and move some of the more dry stuff that's been out on the surface for the past, you know, how many days, and move it down low and bring some of the more damp stuff that's down low up to the surface, so it too has a chance to evaporate and dry a little bit. And over time, all this material will just become a lot more crumbly, a lot more loose, and also just a lot more unappealing for its inhabitants to remain in. So yeah, I think it is probably going to be successful, because I didn't really know what to expect. But once I start seeing baby worms, it tells me, yeah, I think things are going to be okay. You know, naturally, I'm also kind of keeping an eye out, see if I could spot any cocoons, which I really don't know if I've seen any. But then again, a lot of times I don't really see them until I slow down significantly. So me just plowing through the stuff like this, it's very unlikely that I'll spot anything. But that's fine. We're just going to continue on the assumption that there probably are a whole bunch of cocoons still floating around this material, still, you know, on the ready to be hatched and to produce more baby worms for us in the near future. And, you know, sometimes it happens within a few weeks, sometimes it takes a little longer. And usually I'm in not too much of a rush to, you know, have this process run its course, so we'll continue to check in on it. But I think now I'm going to head upstairs to get some food that we're going to feed the other adult bin with, and then we'll also bring a little extra that we could toss in here before we shut things down. So break time, I'll be right back with some food, and we'll continue. Now, a good portion of what I bought down here for them is coffee. A lot of times I just come down here with one day's worth of coffee that's in the filter still, but today I've got two. So I think besides giving this bin, maybe, I don't know, what I had in mind for this was maybe one part of a banana peel. Here's another part that we'll put into the other bin. A whole bunch of carrots, so I thought some of these carrots could go in here as well. As you can see, all frozen stuff, so all stuff that I believe is going to start to break down quite nicely once it starts to thaw. But I really don't want to go overboard, right? Because I'm going to put coffee in here too. So I figure between this cucumber, banana peel, a couple carrots, that's got to be plenty. I mean, we only saw a couple baby worms that have so far made their way into there. So we certainly don't need to go overboard in terms of adding food. But I also figured I would just use some of this coffee here. In fact, this is the one that I just took out of the coffee maker, and it's still warm. The other one is from what I took out of the machine last night when I reset the machine. But I've already emptied the coffee machine, and I won't be resetting it tonight because I am going away for the 4th of July weekend, and this is really the last of my bins that I've been trying to get ready to make sure everything's well fed before I take off for a couple days and I'm out of town. So I'm kind of glad to be at the end of my to-do list in terms of taking care of my my worm bins. So I don't know, I just figured we'd go through one more quick stir of this stuff over here and try to bring some of this more moist stuff up to the surface so we can get more exposure to air and dry a little bit. And we've got the food in there, so we're in pretty good shape. I'm just wondering if I want to add any more bedding. I mean, I don't think it's necessary. There's so many leaves and paper and cardboard and everything else in there. It does seem like we're in good shape as far as this feeding zone is concerned. So I think we're ready to pack this system up, put it back up on the shelf, and let it continue. So let's see, how did I have this before? I did try to pretty thoroughly push this plastic bag up against the walls of the container to prevent any sort of evaporation, any moisture from escaping the bin over here. And even though the feeding zone kind of ends over here, I did kind of drape it out over the material too to allow some of this material on the edge to get nice and damp too, hopefully drawing the worms in, and then the food itself and all that other fresh bedding being what kind of motivates them to move over all the way at the end. So that's where we stand so far with the 37-day-old cocoon nursery. Let's get the adult worms out here and feed them. Alright, so here we have the adult bin. It's only covered with a sheet of cardboard and a sheet of paper. It's a paper bag. Actually, there's even more coverings. A couple pieces of newspaper. So, even though it's not a material that will prevent moisture from going through it, it does seem to be doing a pretty good job keeping the moisture in. And on top of that, we've even got one more piece of covering here, which is really my indicator of where we last fed. This is my feeding zone indicator. A used coffee filter. So we've got a few layers of paper and cardboard doing a pretty good job keeping the moisture down within this bin. When I first started the bin, I was covering up with plastic, and then I think it might have just been at the last feeding that we decided it was time to remove the plastic, that the material on its own was already starting to increase in capability of retaining, hanging on to its own moisture, and not needing any more help from a plastic covering. And what do we got going on here? So it was down the middle here, as the coffee filter was indicating where we last fed. Here we got a nice big fat night crawler. I think as far as, you know, the worms go, like I said earlier, there's blue worms in here, which I think dominate the population. And then I know there's red wigglers and European night crawlers in here, but I believe it's the European night crawlers that might be in the fewest numbers. But it is kind of cool to see a big fat worm cruising around amidst a bunch of smaller, skinnier worms, because the red wigglers and the blue worms are all the skinny worms that you see. And then the way to distinguish those from one another is that the blue worms are the super mobile ones, the really fast ones. And they just like to get up and go. It's kind of cool. It's the first time I've had that type of worm in my wormery. It's just interesting to see how active they are. Just like any other worm, they don't like being out there exposed to the bright lights from overhead. So they're all just trying to retreat out of view of the bright light. It's a smart, natural response, right? Because from a worm's perspective, bright light typically means one of a couple things, both of which are pretty dangerous. Number one is, you know, sunlight and bright, dry air. When you're out in the sunlight, you're in danger of drying out, and drying out is something that a worm does not want to have happen, right? But I mean, the other thing that happens when you're out in the daylight is that the predators can see you. So all the birds can spot you, and all the other little creatures that are looking for a quick, easy meal can see you. So it makes good sense to retreat out of the bright lights, back into the safety of the darkness beneath the surface of the material, to basically preserve your life. What do we have here? So I thought there'd be a lot more leftovers, you know, because like I said earlier, I did not freeze the food that was placed in here, the salad mix. But luckily we're not seeing too many leftovers. I'm feeling some mushy stuff here and there, but nothing that I could really discern as whatever it was previously. I mean, here obviously is a chunk of leaf, piece of salad that did not break down. But as we explored the middle of the bin here where the feeding had been, we certainly didn't see much. And now I don't know if I'm just bumping into the same piece of leaf as what we saw earlier. But I mean, if those couple pieces of leftover salad is all that remains from the last feeding, I'm glad we're back in here to feed again. I believe the last time we were in here 9 days ago, the previous interval between feedings had been 10 days. So almost the same amount of time had passed between feedings the last time I came in here. And even then, it seemed like they had more or less done away with the majority of what they'd been given. So it did seem 9 days would be a good you know, opportune time to come in here and see how they're doing and make sure they've got what they need. So, you know, I just can't seem to resist. I want to just probe around down in here and see how things look out on the edges, you know, away from the feeding area. Because for whatever reason, I don't know, for whatever reason, the feeding area often seems like a popular spot. But sometimes when the majority of the food appears to have been depleted already, as is the case in this bin, sometimes it seems like the worms just go cruising around looking for other places to be in. You know, away from the feeding area seems to sometimes be the place where you can find the greatest number of worms. It almost seems like out here on this edge, we're seeing even more worms than we saw where the feeding had been recently applied. And maybe they just did away with the food and now they're just kind of cruising around looking for other stuff, nibbling on bedding. And they're certainly doing a good job on breaking the materials in this bin down. I kind of like the idea of mixing a lot of this castings material that's already been broken down together with some of the fresh bedding that surrounds it. And boy, does this have a nice fresh smell to it. It's the last thing you would expect, right? It's one of the most common questions that I see in my comments of my videos, you know. What does it smell like? It must stink. No. It smells like a nice, clean, fresh earth. Kind of that smell of a forest floor after a summer rain, right? Oh, except I spoke too soon. I think I smell one of the interesting things that I placed in here that I normally don't feed my bins with, which is onion. It was just part of what that salad had been made up of. And sometimes onion does have a little bit of a funky smell as it's breaking down. I think that's probably the main reason some people don't feed their worm bins with it, just because of the somewhat pungent odor. It doesn't bother me, but I guess some people just don't like it. So I think that's one of the main reasons sometimes you hear people saying don't feed onion. But as far as the worms are concerned, they'll eat it just like any other decomposing vegetable matter or fruit. So here too, I'm just thinking it might be nice to blend in some fresh bedding along with a lot of these worked castings that are making up this side of the bin too. It almost seems like there was a lot of leaves in the middle that I've thrown over to this side. It almost seems like this edge of the bedding has a lot of paper and cardboard type bedding. So why don't we throw some of these leaves and kind of even things out a little bit. Create a nice sort of consistent bedding rich material throughout the bin. I think it was in this bin. It was a couple feedings ago when I kind of came in here and I built sort of an underlayer, if that makes sense. Basically, I felt like the material in the bin, even after just a few weeks, was becoming very rich in castings. So I kind of moved everything aside, laid down some fresh bedding, moved the contents of the bin back over to the top of it. And I did that throughout the entire bin. So the entire bin sort of got a fresh boost of bedding by having it layered right down into the bottom and underneath all of the existing material that was already in the bin. So now I'm just sort of encountering some of that stuff down low as I probe around. And I kind of like the idea of bringing it up and mixing it into the material so that there's a good rich amount of bedding all throughout the bin. So that's just been my theme lately. I've been really working hard to try to increase the bedding in all of my bins significantly. And we're going to do the same here today with today's feeding. Oops, just kind of threw a whole bunch of leafy material all over the place. So when you hit one of these leaf stems and it's like a little spring, just catapults a bunch of material all over the place. So, all right. This is kind of a fun bin, so I do get sidetracked and just kind of get into the whole exploring the bin activity sometimes. So let's get this job done. So I'm going to take a whole bunch of these shredded pieces of paper that I showed earlier. I spent a whole bunch of time yesterday taking newspaper bits out of the recycling bin, types of newspaper that I thought would be suitable for worm composting. Not the glossy stuff, but the more kind of just matte sort of paper. So some of it might appear to have slightly glossy looking print on it, but the paper itself, I believe, is not the glossy, plasticky kind of paper. It is all the regular newsprint type of paper, which is really just wood pulp, which really breaks down easily, and the worms really do like it. So I'm going to grab another handful of this stuff. We're going to go really generous. Something I heard recently was that the blue worms that I think, like I said earlier, I think they dominate as far as being the majority of the worms in this container. From what I heard, they really like the bedding, so I'm going to give them what they like. Give them a whole bunch of bedding. And another chunk of bedding that they're going to get is the filter of this batch of coffee, as well as the other filter too that the other batch of coffee was in. So I don't even know if we need to go crazy ripping this stuff into pieces. It'll soften up, and the next time we come in here and we start moving stuff around, it'll get torn up, and maybe even get torn up a little bit just by the worms working their way through this stuff. So we're just going to drop it right in here. That's a nice healthy amount of bedding, right? Besides all the newspaper, those 2 coffee filters. And then it just takes us to the food, which might not seem that much, but with all that coffee and all that bedding, which I treat as food as well, it does seem like a pretty generous portion to me. So the one thing in here that might take some time is this mango seed. Everything else, I believe, is going to go quite quickly. These strawberry tops, this chunk of cucumber, even the banana peel is going to go pretty quick. You know, sometimes there's a little bit of the skin remaining, but they usually nibble away all the fleshy parts of the banana peel pretty quickly. In here too, some sort of a leafy green, which because it was frozen, I think will break down even more quickly than the salad greens that were put in here, because those salad greens were not frozen, and as a result, they're just going to always take a little bit longer to break down. So we're almost done. I just want to sprinkle in a little bit of these crushed eggshells, which is the form of grit that I use to provide the worms what they need to aid in their digestion of the foods that they eat. And guess what we're going to add as a finishing topping layer? Yep, you guessed it. More bedding, but this time it's going to be in the form of leaves. So I'm just going to throw a little bit of fresh leafy matter right over what we just added. But then we're going to bring in all of the other stuff, all of this commingled castings and old aged bedding. It's been in the worm for how long now? Bring it all across the top surface, spread it all out. But as you can see, I'm still holding my box of leaves because I'd like to just sprinkle one last application of it all across the top to give the whole bin, across the entire top surface, a nice leafy topping. So a lot of dry paper on the bottom, all that newsprint, a lot of dry leaves here on the top as well. And that in the past had worried me. I always thought that this stuff was going to act as sort of a sponge and absorb all the moisture in the bin and leave the environment way too inhospitable and dry and make it uncomfortable for the worms, but I really don't think that's the case. I believe with all the moisture that's already present within the system, as well as the moisture that's going to be emitted by the frozen foods that we just added, I got a feeling that the material in here is going to be just fine. And besides that, I have been trying to run all my bins a little bit drier lately too, but not so dry that it would become dangerous for the worms, right? Because since worms breathe through their skin and they need the dampness, they need their skin to remain nice and damp so that they can breathe. Don't want to get too dry, because if you do, you run the risk of, you know, depriving your poor worms of the oxygen that they need. All right, everyone, that was fun. It's always fun checking in on this bin with the mixed worms in it. I'm curious to see where we end up with that cocoon nursery too. Hopefully we'll have a whole bunch of babies to throw in here too at some point soon. So that's the end of the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Bye now.